Morena, everyone, and welcome to Strategy, Finance and Risk. Okay. Meeting of the Monday, the 26th of June, 2023, past the longest day. I missed the polar plunge, Mr. Chief Executive. Did it go well?
It went very well, thank you. Yeah.
It was jolly cold.
Yeah, it was warmer in than out.
Okay, just a reminder about health and safety. If the alarm sounds, we go out that door at the back and across the road and assemble over the other side of the road and await instructions from the staff. Everyone needs to be aware that this meeting is being live streamed and the video will be publicly available on YouTube. Gosh, Stephen, you look a long way away. Yes. And just a reminder about these microphones. Remember, they are quite sensitive. If you move your head around, we lose you, one speaker at a time. And can everyone make sure that their mobile phones are off or on silent? Shad, would you like to open with a karakia for us, please? Thank you.
Morena tātou, tuatahi rā, ka tuku mihi kia koe rā and Māori, tātou kua huitahi nei, me ki rei ngā āpiha, ngā kaimahi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nō reira, me timata hoki tātou, me tuku karakia, nō reira kia noi tātou. He honore, he korore ki te atua, he maunga rongo ki te whenua whakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. E te atua anei rā mātou, he huitahi nei tēnei ata, tuku reo whakamoemiti, tuku reo whakawhetai ki a koe. Toro mai rā tōringa kaha ki runga ki tēnā mātou, hei āwhina, hei torotu, hei āwhina, hei manaaki nei a tātou rotu i nei mahi. Kia pai haere tēnei o tō tātou nei hoi. Nō reire te atua, tēnei mātune tine ki a koe, korore ki tōnga tapu. Āmeni.
Thanks, Shad. So, apologies. So we've got an apology from Māteri for absence and for Wayne for going to leave for a tangi at about 10:30. And Tapio is on his way, we hope. Okay, would someone like to move that we accept those apologies? Shad and Bill, thank you. All those in favour say aye. Gets carried. We don't have any late. Well, we do have one late item, and that is the minutes.
Did you want to hear both sets of minutes?
That's right. Yes, why don't we do the minutes, both sets of minutes together? They are, yeah, so they're a late item. So would someone like to move that we accept them as a late item?
Happy to move.
Thank you, Bill and Wayne. All those in favour say aye. Against carried. Confidential business transferred into the open, there is none. Changed order of business, there is one. We're going to swap round the first two items. The GHD are coming in to do a presentation on the forecasting assumptions, and they can't come until 10. So, oh, okay. Well, we haven't got a change to the order of business in that case. Thank you. So, confirmation of minutes of the Strategy, Finance and Risk Committee meeting. That's all the minutes outlined under late items from the 6th of June. Now, they are available in Stella and they will be made available and have been made available. I'm sorry, I've checked that everyone's seen them in Stella. Someone like to move that they're a true and correct record? Stephen and Bruce, thank you. Any discussion? All those in favour say aye. Against carried. Right, so that brings us to item 1, and that's the long-term plan, significant forecasting assumptions. I take it Christine, Josh, why don't we get you all up? And we've got David Norman from GHD, who's also going to be part of it. You would like to come up to the top table? James. Doesn't look like Cherie. James, welcome.
I'll just do a quick introduction just to put this in context. So the long-term plan is based on a series of assumptions. You've previously adopted the assumptions for the LTP, and those are the ones the staff are working on to prepare the document, the long-term plan budgets and information, which is well underway. I think you're having a session, this committee, after this meeting, just to talk about what's happening as part of that. We do update the assumptions as we're working through the process as things change. So this is an update report. There have been some changes in a number of areas, seeking your support for these updated financial forecasting assumptions, which will then blend straight back into the process. So I'll let the team talk about the specific ones that we're seeking some direction on.
Morning. Just to introduce James, to introduce David to start off with.
Good morning. So David Norman's here from GHD. He's a chief economist for Australia and New Zealand. Previous to that, he was a chief economist at Auckland Council and has worked with Burl, who have been our traditional source of the assumptions for LCP for cost escalations. So we've got a presentation here where we've landed for these CPI and cost escalations for CapEx for the long-term plan. So I'll hand over to David.
Fantastic, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Now, who's running the slides? Is there you're just going to click through, or do I get a pointer, or you're gonna work through it? Okay, fantastic. See if you can keep up with my animations. That's all good. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you today about the work that we've been working on with James and the team. We'll just move to the next slide, please. So very quickly, what I want to talk through with you is why we did the work, what we did, headline results, some extra work we did on supply chain and price risk management, and then what happens next. I'd also say that, I'm obviously going to be talking about the forecasts that we've produced and some of the sources we used for that. If you do have questions on broader macroeconomic questions or whatever that come out of the work, then by all means, please ask. Okay, so why we did the work. So we've already referenced the fact that Burl, for example, does produce cost adjusters, if you like. There are existing generalized forecasts and projections that have typically been made available through Solgum and LGNZ. Waka Kotahi produces their own indices that are backward looking, so they use those for cost adjustment or for inflation adjusting contracts. So they say, oh, what's happened over the last 3 months or 6 months? And so they've got a long series going back to about 2014, looking at how they adjust contracts. But one of the challenges with the Waka Kotahi work, it's excellent, it's good that they have it, but it's backward looking, doesn't give you an idea about the future. And secondly, some of the challenges with some of the other existing series is just that they don't take particularly good account of the mix of capital works projects that you as an individual council are undertaking. So if we just click next, please. And so what we wanted to do was develop a series of indices that represented what Tauranga is actually committing to do through the LTP process, and that was highly representative of what it is that you do. And so our sort of somewhat arbitrary, but it seemed to work well. We've done this now with a number of councils, and what we've learned is that you need to cover around 80% or more of the anticipated capital works to get a representative basket of what you're trying to forecast. And so that little donut graph there gives you an indication of what we're covering here. We ended up building 5 indices. You can see the biggest ones on there, and the only bit we haven't covered is the bit that's called other, which is the 19%. So we hit about 81%, which means you get a pretty representative set of indices. And then the specific need for the client was, you were looking at the typical 3-year forecasts that we do, but also a longer projection over the LTP horizon. Okay, so let's move on. Thank you. So what were our objectives? We had three. First was to develop a set of output indices to sort of explain what has happened historically across these major categories of work that you do. Next, please, was to develop forecasts then of what we think is going to happen over those three to about a 12-year time frame. And finally, was to comment on some of the supply chain risks and strategies to manage some of those risks. Okay, next slide. So this is a slightly boring bit, but the intent here is to give you confidence that there was a robust process and that we didn't make this up sitting in a room on our own, but we looked at other sources, spoke to contractors and the likes who actually deliver this sort of work every day. So the first thing we did was work with the council to identify what those major groups of expenditure were so that we could build a representative basket of capital projects. We evaluated the existing indices. I've talked about some of those already. We have incorporated Waka Kotahi's indices into some of the backward-looking historical elements of the work. And then we wanted to identify appropriate proxies for some of the major materials categories. So if you think of the two main examples there, bitumen and steel, bitumen obviously a really an important part of road construction or road renewals, steel an important part of vertical construction. And we wanted to identify ways that we could meaningfully forecast those. And so oil as a major input into bitumen, iron ore as a major input into steel provide really good proxies for those. And so we identified appropriate historical series and forward-looking forecasts on those. Fourthly, we wanted to identify the weightings for the individual inputs. So what does that mean? When you build a road, what goes into it? You've got a mix of workers doing the work, you've got your materials, bitumen, but not only bitumen, other materials as well. You've got plant and machinery, you've got overheads. And so we wanted to make sure that we understood what that mix was. We worked with Waka Kotahi on some of that, but also spoke to contractors ourselves and to TCC to establish what those mixes would be. And then a final step was looking at how much of those different materials in particular go into different indices. So for example, road construction has a slightly different composition from road renewals in terms of labor and materials and the like. So if we press the next slide, that'll just give you a picture on the right-hand side there. Again, I won't bore you with all the details, but effectively we started with a bunch of inputs that gave us a group of green input indices. And from that, we moved into the 5 output indices that we modeled for TCC. Next slide, process continued. Sorry, there's a little bit more detail on this. We then want to look at the forecasts that were already available. So looking at the Reserve Bank, Treasury, trading banks, and to incorporate some of those views into our forecasts. My personal my professional view is you're better to err on the side of being conservative, in other words, potentially overestimating cost increases rather than the opposite. You'd rather get a good surprise than a bad surprise. And so in some instances, including step 6 there, speaking to contractors and the like, we moderated some of those forecasts so that they actually allow for a little bit more growth in prices. And then moving forward from that, we developed our forecasts. And then finally, quite importantly, when you see the headline graphs, you're going to think, I could have done that. It looks like almost a straight line. That's because we have raw forecasts, and I'll show you a picture of one in a minute. But for the purposes of budgeting and forecasting, you don't want an oil price that goes like that, and therefore bitumen prices that are all over the place. You need a smoother line that you can actually use for budgeting purposes. So if you press the next thing, you'll see is that's the bitumen forecast. And just a macroeconomic segue here. The reason you've got that big dip is the global economic weakness that we're seeing right now. So oil prices are down. Europe, the US, demand for oil is a lot lower. So prices have actually fallen, and therefore bitumen, oil, plastics prices are actually lower now. But you wouldn't want to be doing quarterly forecasting into your LTP process because you'd get all kinds of funny results. So in the final in the final forecast, we've smoothed through the sort of bumps of the data there. Okay, so if we carry on to the next slide, and so this is a little bit more interesting. This is sort of the headlines and the outlook that we see. Cost escalation is not going to go away anytime soon. I didn't mention it in these slides here, but a statistic that I find quite useful in setting the scene for these kinds of conversations is that the G20 did a study about a year, 18 months ago now, looking at 56 of the world's biggest economies and their capital works intentions, their infrastructure spend intentions over the next 20 years. And roughly speaking, those 56 economies plan to invest 15 times New Zealand's total annual GDP into infrastructure every year for the next 20 years. So we're competing for resources with all of them, okay? And that's workers, but it's also even plant and materials. And so this isn't going to go away anytime soon, even though some of the indices are slowing down a little, especially in the face of lower commodity prices for oil. So in terms of materials here, bitumen prices have fallen, as I said, lower oil prices with economic weakness expected to pick up a little bit later. Steel prices are down a little, but again, with the infrastructure investment aren't actually falling as sharply. And then a lot of our other materials are actually produced here in New Zealand, which gives us a little bit of a buffer in terms of exchange rates and those sort of international commodity prices. Next, please. So here's just a couple of charts. The first one's the same one, that bitumen one you've seen. The bottom one's steel. You had that really crazy spike in steel prices, but they've come down a little, but a lot more moderate at relatively high levels. Next slide, please. New Zealand dollar remains weaker. The surprise announcement the other day from the Reserve Bank that they weren't going to raise interest rates further, I think that was actually the right call. But I and many others had anticipated that they would go further, and my view was that they would have to rein it in, bring it back in the second half of the year. But now that they've signaled they're probably not going to raise more, that means that they're not going to have to pull back later, but it also sends a signal to the market that we're going to have lower interest rates here than anticipated, and therefore that makes the New Zealand dollar a bit weaker. On the other hand, immigration is fast approaching all-time records. So about 10 months ago, we were losing 20,000 people a year, and we're now gaining 60,000. So that's an 80,000 turnaround in less than a year. It's really dramatic, and that does mean that over the medium term, we can expect to see slower rises in labour costs. Next, please. And then finally, we need to talk about the cyclone and other damage up in Auckland, for example, from the earlier floods. There is a lot of work to be done. We saw with Canterbury and the earthquakes down there, everyone knew someone who moved down to work on the rebuild, but actually a lot of the labour for that rebuild came from overseas. There were marginal impacts on other parts of the country, but not wholesale changes. So we're expecting there will be marginal impacts. We've tried to incorporate that into our forecasts here, but obviously the bulk of the huge price increases for getting work done will be in the Hawke's Bay. Okay, so that's sort of the headlines. So then this is your set of forecasts for the 5 indices. As I say, pretty smooth looking lines. Belies the level of detail and the underlying story, because we've tried to smooth through those bumps so that you get a more sensible line for the purposes of forecasting. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all of this in great detail. I've highlighted little bits in yellow there. These are slides from the report that we produced, so you've probably seen these already anyway. So I'll just focus on the bits in yellow to not take too much of your time. So this is roading projects, so roading construction. With lower oil prices, lower bitumen prices, we're expecting to see slightly more moderate rises in costs here than we have recently seen. But from late 24, as the world economy recovers and demand for oil increases, we're going to see that element pick up again, even as labour shortages ease a little. Next slide, please. So road renewals, slightly different mix of what goes into them, as you can see on the donut chart there. But a similar story, bitumen's played a big role in fast increases. And so the same thing, we're seeing weaker bitumen prices now, so materials are not going to increase as fast, and then a bit of an uptick again expected from the end of next year. Next slide, please. The vertical infrastructure, so vertical construction. Again, steel is an important component here and is prone to fluctuation, but we're seeing more steady prices now at an elevated level. And as I pointed out earlier, government purchases globally will remain quite strong. Everyone's sort of trying to infrastructure their way out of economic weakness, and so that competition will remain strong, and that will keep steel prices relatively high. Next slide, please. Parks and reserves. So a smaller part of what you do, I think it was 6 or 7%, but nevertheless an interesting one because it has a far wider variety of inputs than, say, a road. You know, your materials could be anything from playground material to grasses and planting and so on. So quite a broad mix of products that we had to account for in there. Most of them are purchased locally. And so that actually helps to protect a little bit from the vagaries of those international commodity prices. Next slide, please. Water reticulation, big component, obviously, of the current capital works program. But again, a lot of this is dependent on materials from here, and therefore not nearly as exposed to international fluctuations. And that might be all of them. I can't remember. There might be one more. Oh, yeah, that was all. And so then just to finish off very quickly, another thing we were asked to look at was supply chain risk management and price risk management. Again, that's in the report. That'll be available for you if you want to have more of a read through that. But what was really interesting, speaking to James and some of his colleagues, was actually TCC's, in my view, further ahead than many councils in terms of actually adopting some of the approaches I'll walk through in a minute to try and mitigate some of those risks. A lot of councils are really at the beginning of that journey to trying to manage those risks by using the tools that I'll talk about in a minute. And so I was quite encouraged that, this isn't me sort of being a propaganda minister or anything, but I was quite encouraged that I thought you're already looking at that and doing some of these things, which is actually really good. It's positioning you better than many councils. But when we talk about this risk, it's usually linked to sort of three things. How long is the project? Because anything, the longer the time frame, anything could happen in that time frame that increases risk. How big is the project, and especially the materials component of that project, because that's where the biggest risks are. And then, and so that's the third point there in terms of the particular risk profile of a project. Next slide, please. So this is a schematic. I won't go through all the detail, and I apologize, the purple's almost unreadable with the light there, but effectively, I tried to set out in very simple terms the different levers or the different drivers of cost escalation risk. You've got your supply side and you've got your demand side. Demand side, I'll talk through very quickly. I already have, everyone's trying to build infrastructure in New Zealand and overseas, huge demand, okay? On the supply side, you've had all sorts of things. Because of COVID, we've had lockdowns, we've had supply chain disruptions, we've got heightened geopolitical tensions, Russia, Ukraine, China and some of the other economies in the region. We've had certain suppliers that have been impacted quite badly. Many have closed as a consequence of COVID. And so you've had logistics disruption and you've had lost access to supply. And so if you take these things together, this leads to time delays and cost escalation. And some of you will say, well, that's really the same thing, because ultimately time delay means higher prices. And so that leads to a number of supply side mitigations that you can take. So I might actually just get you to click the arrow 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 times, and it'll just bring up the little boxes on the side there. There you go. Okay. And so you've effectively got at least these 7 supply side mitigations. Our report details what's involved in these, but the first one is around shared risk, so more of an open book approach. We're starting to see a lot more of this in local government. We've found some clients that I have in the local government sector will put a project out to tender and they will get no bids at all because they're expecting the tenderer to take on all the risk. It is a seller's market, and in that environment, that's not going to work. And so we're seeing many councils now, including yourselves, consider sharing some of that risk, having more of an open book approach. Secondly, direct purchase of volatile price materials. So we're looking at, Waka Kotahi already doing that in terms of bitumen and the likes. Thirdly, buying components early. So you need to build a bridge or something like that, or something where there's components. Maybe you buy those components early and direct. Fourthly, securing your place in the queue by paying trusted suppliers, and that's an important one. You have to be really careful of that and do your due diligence over paying early. Fifth, trying to design out costs or looking at alternative materials. Sixth, can we source this in New Zealand? Even if it's a little bit more expensive at the beginning, it might reduce the risk of us not being able to complete it on time. And then finally, we've always got contingency planning in there. There's normally there's a budget for some contingency in there, but we're having to relook at that. So a lot of the work I'm doing with councils now is around saying our capital works budget's just not going to go as far as we thought it would. How do we reprioritize in a coherent way? Because the money just doesn't go as far. Much bigger contingencies going in. Okay, so that's the end of that slide. I think that's just about all I have to say. What happens next? We will be reviewing these forecasts every 6 months. So you'll have seen on the first slide of the presentation, it actually said March 23 because those are March forecasts. So we'll be doing the September forecast update at the end of that. We'll provide an updated slide deck every 6 months that gives you the macroeconomic view as well. And then talking to James and the team, if in the future we move towards a different composition of some of those indices, for example, timber structural elements rather than steel, it'll be a matter of reviewing those indices to make sure that they still capture what it is that we're delivering. That's all I have to say. So very happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, David. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. I must admit, when I saw the charts on page 9, which sort of sets out the whole sector, that the alignment with CPI was much closer than I had expected.
Yes.
The traditional conversation in the local government sector is that our input costs are higher than
Much
the average
higher.
CPI.
Yeah.
And I acknowledge that they're smoothed, but I mean, you've almost got a kind of a direct correlation with CPI, given that sort of longer term view. Yet, if you look back in the last 3 years, and I appreciate it's a particularly volatile last 3 years, but if you were to take the historic view as Waka Kotahi do, is the association with CPI as consistent as your forecast suggests? Because, if there's some volatility there, it begs the question, should we try and game this in some way? Should we try and predict when the peaks and troughs are going to occur and massage our project start times to try and ride the tide, if you like?
Yeah. Okay. Happy to answer those questions. So firstly, broadly, and I don't mean this facetiously at all, but yes, they're both going up. So there's probably a correlation of 0.7 just because they're both going up. But we've come through a period, if you look at sort of the 3 years of historical that we actually show on the charts, we've come through a period where we've had exceptionally strong rises across the production indices for all the construction categories, actually, partly because of the craziness of COVID, but also even before that, the last bit before that. But one of the reasons that the two move so closely now is not only do we anticipate that Overall rises in construction costs will be a little bit more moderate than they have been over the last 3 years, but we've also got inflation that's far higher than it's been in a very long time. So over the first few years, you've actually got inflation at a higher rate, and you've got the rate of growth in construction costs falling a little. And so they sort of come back quite close together. And then beyond about 4 years, so this is a technical distinction, but the first 3 to 4 years are forecasts, and beyond that are projections, right? So the first 3 to 4 years are based on all the smartest people we know in terms of the Reserve Bank and Treasury trading banks, our own discussions with contractors. And then from year 4, we're effectively saying, well, longer term averages, which is, assumes inflation gets down to 2 or just above 2, I think. And for construction costs gets to just above 2.5, I believe, over that time frame. But that's from the 4 years out. The first few years, far more volatility, but not reflected in those charts. I think, I don't recall actually if we put the raw charts for the output indices into the original slide deck, but we do have those available if that's something you'd like to see to see what that volatility looks like.
Would be interested in having a look at that. So what does this mean in terms of expected cost rises in percentage terms? 2 to 3%. Is that what we're looking at?
At the out point, but earlier on it's significantly higher. So in some categories we're looking at sort of 6 or 7%. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but again we've fed through the indices, so you can have a row by row look at that information.
Because it sort of suggests that maybe you defer some of your bigger projects 2 or 3 years, and you might be able to get some advantage. I mean, obviously the costs are going to be built in, but at least
it also depends what interest rates are going to be at the time, right? So and how much lower they might be than they are now. Yeah.
No? James, thank you. Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
I think there's still more questions for James, though, aren't there? Haven't you got more questions on the assumptions? Yeah. You can take us through so Christine indicated there's some assumptions you want some direction on. Is that correct?
We're just updating you on the work that we've done since February. So when you saw them in February, we noticed that the employment and sector projection assumption was the data was a little bit out of date. So we've used the latest one, which was updated at the end of 2022. There's the work that David's just talked about for the assumptions that GHD have done. We've revised the interest rate assumptions based on the latest stuff to come out from the official cash rate announcements. There was also 2 that you requested us add, which was, I believe, around the RMA reform and the impact of growth beyond city boundaries, which we've done and in there now. And the last was just an update of the waters assumption after Labor announced the latest entities.
Thank you. I think there's still some uncertainty as to whether we've captured accurately the impact of growth. Bill, did you want to talk about that?
Thanks, Chair. And certainly that impact of growth clearly focuses on transport. There is some reference to community facilities, but it just occurred to me, whether that is sufficient, not just in terms of the impact on growth, but what actually exists now, and whether it's sufficiently captured in terms of what happens, for example, in the Western Bay, and then the potential demand or use in terms of not just transport infrastructure, but certainly in terms of the community facilities, and whether that's aquatic, libraries, etc. So I just wanted to highlight that, and in terms of getting a response to that concern. But again, making it clear it's just not growth in the future, but whether it's appropriate to capture what actually exists now and the risks and the impact of that now.
So we do cover that at an individual project level. So when the Te Manawa Take o Te Papa business case comes to you, it clearly identifies what, in terms of the inner city, the TCC area, the wider sub-region, and sort of nationally. So we do it at that level. And similarly, when we're planning for other things like the aquatics facilities, etc., we're looking at the whole of the broader catchment. So we can put some words in there. We haven't done that, disclosed that, but we can add another section into the assumptions if you like. And the other thing, as part of the long-term plan growth investment, we are just now going back and looking and saying, if that's a level of growth investment, what might that do to where and the timing of growth rollout, and we'll bring that back because that might need to have some refinement to what we've currently got. So that's another piece of work that's underway. If that means that there's a flow on, then we'll be coming back with a revision to the growth projections and the timing of that within the LTP, these forecasting assumptions. But so we can add a section in about how infrastructure that you're providing is meeting demands outside, but current council demand, growth demand in the TCC area, and demand outside of that area, if that's what you're looking for.
I think that would be helpful, Chair, particularly in terms of future initiatives and future discussions, in terms of at least having it clearly recognised.
Anything else? Yeah, shared.
I just had a question about item number 34 and the assumptions about disruptive technologies. And just reflecting on a couple of the conversations commissioners have been having, particularly around AI in the last few weeks. And things are moving quite quickly in that space. And just wanting to make sure that we're kind of it's a challenge to get ahead of those things. And I know things are moving quite quickly. And at those that kind of technology, potentially have positives and negatives in terms of council business, and just wanting to understand whether the team have factored in that into these assumptions in any way.
Not specifically called out in the assumptions, but we do at the start of the process do what we call an environmental scan, and we look at there's information on AI, and that's all done as part of the group or the activity planning that is done, which is all part of it. We can, like the other one, add some information further to that to cover that.
Else? Bill.
This is assumption 12, related to the service delivery method. The discussion around the risks, understand section 17 review, etc., revealing more cost-efficient methods of delivering services. I'm raising it. Does this then drive that focus, for example, on the contracting out of facilities, as opposed to what the best or ideal outcome would be in terms of the delivery of those services? Because there's more to the delivery than just the bottom line or the lowest price for that. So I just wanted some clarification on that.
I'm happy to speak to that. So we do have the statutory requirement under section 17 to look at options, but certainly when we're doing that, we're not just looking at financial benefits and costs, we're looking at non-financial benefits as costs. So and there have been choices made in the past that reflect that. So.
Okay. And finally, Chair, just on page 23, number 3, demographic changes, staff might just want to have a look at the percentage of the percentages of the Tauranga population. They don't quite add up, and they're different to then the graph on the other side. So it was just something to be looked at.
I was looking at that, trying to make a bit of sense of it. I assumed that, I think I came to the conclusion that there's probably another column of others, and especially looking at the citizenship ceremonies where there's always over 20 different countries involved. But I wanted to also comment on the population. I've been talking about the growth of Tauranga City being about 3,000 a year, but looking at this, it looks like it's more like 4,000 a year. If we've got 19,000 over the last 5 years, which is an even more rapid growth than we've been talking about. Do you want to comment on the percentages? Should they add up to 100? They normally do.
Yes.
100 would be.
Yeah. We'll go back and check that.
Okay, so, Bruce.
Thank you. And look, I just wanted to ask really questions, not so much about the information, I think it's actually superb, and I actually like this, particularly the second one about the mitigations. I'm interested actually in the use of this information. So you've got some where your assumptions range from even low to high uncertainty, and I'm just interested to know where you will pitch in terms of your actual plan, number one question. The second one is, I hear that we'll get the updated version, obviously I take it in September. When do you stop reviewing the information and you know, sort of have to put the numbers together? Because clearly any significant movement right up and dare I say it to probably 30 June could be of impact on our LTP. But I'm just interested to know the steps from here, where you will pitch your numbers and when do you hope they'll stop moving?
Yeah, they obviously are moving around all the time, but we'll have to go through an audit as part of the LTP. I believe we're planning to adopt the LTP full audit on the 11th of September. So we'd, I guess, put a line in the sand at that point, and then that would be the assumptions for consultation.
Well, thank you. That's great.
It's a critical part of our process. Very helpful, thank you. So is someone prepared to move the recommendation? So we receive the report, then approve the changes in attachment 1, noting the comments that have been made.
Yes, for assumption.
Okay. Assumption 41 gets updated. So you're happy to move those with including that change to that, and C and D. So I see we adopt those assumptions in November. Is that right? Yeah.
That the staff have the direction to prepare the LTP, and then when the draft LTP comes to you, it includes all of the assumptions, and that's when you finally sign it off audit. Yeah.
Okay. Stephen, happy to second. Any further discussion? Thank you very much, and thank you to GHD for, I'm not sure whether it's depressing or challenging or probably all on both, but really appreciate all the work. Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Okay. Alcohol bylaw amendment. Here they are. Here they are. Morning. Sarah?
Good morning. Yeah,
Jane,
yes,
sorry,
thanks.
Jane.
Yeah, yeah. Good morning. We've
I was
got
going to say,
something.
it doesn't look like Sarah.
No. So we've got something a bit simpler for you than the last item.
You reckon? You reckon?
I'm hoping so. Yeah. So for the past 5 years, council has put in place a temporary alcohol-free area along the mid part of our coastal strip. So that's been in place, and yeah, over the summertime period. And police report that this has really assisted them to manage any potential disorder and minimise alcohol-related harm. And we're seeking to formalise this approach by incorporating it into the bylaw. So making a simple bylaw amendment because it's just best practice and more efficient than continuing to come to council to get this in place. So effectively, we're not making any effective change because it's been in place for the last 5 years. So but because it's an amendment to a bylaw, we're required by legislation to consult on that. So we're seeking your approval to go out and consult on that change.
There's some confusion, I think, amongst some of us reading this, because you've put in front of us the whole alcohol bylaw intact. And so what you're seeking to do is, instead of with that particular part along the Marine Parade, which is done on a temporary basis for over New Year, Christmas, New Year,
Summertime period. So
over the whole of the
yeah.
summer.
So yeah.
Okay, and so you're seeking to put that in.
Yeah. So we just
basis.
presented the whole bylaw and showed what changes we're just incorporating that into the bylaw. So it's clearer for the community and it's just more efficient.
Okay, and I think what's happened is we've all had a look at the bylaw in its entirety and gone, wow, this is quite draconian. And yeah, it's 6 months of the year. And I looked at the Strand and the area, and and we're developing a big events lawn and a wine bar on the wharf and all of that, and thought, wow, we're at odds.
So this is in public spaces, so on street spaces. It's not related to sort of licensed premises.
Oh, no, I'm not talking licensed premises. Yeah. I'm talking a big lawn. I'm talking the Strand. I just know the plans that we've got in Masonic Park. All those plans actually are at odds with our bylaw. And that's before we come to look at some of the other areas of the city. Because what you've done is you've actually put the bylaw in front of us with the maps. And there's all of us sitting around the table had no idea. Some of us might have broken the bylaw. Not looking at anyone in particular. I think that sort of sums up looking around the table. That's about where we are. So I guess my question then is, how are we aligning? If we're going to make this bylaw change, we may as well have a look to see whether they're, particularly around the CBD, whether there's other changes that we want to make so that we go out and consult all at once, Mr. Chief Executive.
Yes, I think what's happened here is we've responded to a request by police to try and tidy up what is an annual process of revisiting and bringing the temporary. And I think what you'll find is that the history of this bylaw obviously predates the concept of Te Manawa Taki o Te Papa and the future development of the waterfront. And I think there needs to be, if you like, a joining and an understanding of how that space is intended to be used in the future, and whether or not the bylaw, as it currently exists, aligns with that future use. And I think there's a very clear indication that it doesn't at this stage. So I'm just wondering, we can revisit the entire bylaw in its entirety, and in doing that, align with the vision for the future of the waterfront and the CBD. I think in order for the police to get through this summer and have the powers that they want, we could bring back and go through the temporary process prior to Christmas. Because I think this bylaw needs, I don't think we necessarily want to rush the change to this bylaw. It's something that we can reset. So if we perhaps just leave this paper lying on the table, and what we'll do is come back with a temporary process prior to Christmas and review the bylaw in the new year.
Chad.
Sorry, just on that as well. I'm mindful that it's not just the CBD, it's also the Mount, the bylaw affects. And so it would be useful to make sure that it aligns with the spatial plan review and what we're doing down the Mount as well. I think just to make sure it's joined up.
I think you're right. I mean, spending $5 million on a public walkway with family amenities and all that sort of thing, we need to think about how we want those spaces to be used.
So you've become more complicated than we thought.
Right. So for the first time, we had a look at the whole bylaw. I think it's our first look. One of the interesting questions that perhaps needs to be as part of this, it is an opportunity to have a bit of a review. I know it would make the police's job easier, but it would be good to know the difference, the evidence that the changes have made. It would be good to get a bit of that sort of background. And there's large swathes of the city and that are actually banned, and I understand why. But it'd be good to know whether it's having an effect, because interestingly enough, in another discussion around alcohol, we hear that there are large numbers of people gathering, moving from the Mount to the CBD after the Mount closes, and then gathering in the street and in the car parks and drinking. I would have thought that they would be breaking the bylaw and they would have all been arrested, but that doesn't seem to be happening. So, okay.
So just in terms of timeframes, rather than bring back another report, you could just pass a resolution today to approve this as another temporary period, because all of the information is here, which means that we don't need to come back for you. That gets that out of the way. And you could delegate to the chief executive to ensure that the actual documents reflect that only the temporary, not the whole bylaw review. So we can get that done. We do that to save another round, and then we can come back to you on the broader bylaw review. This kicks in from the 21st of October, so to do that and to it's close enough as it is, rather than waiting another 6 weeks before we come back, if you're comfortable.
So just receive the report in A, and then B, approve the temporary alcohol-free.
So effectively, if you take paragraph 2 of the report and turn that into a resolution, so a temporary alcohol-free area in place for the summer period along the coastal strip between Marine Parade, you approve that sentence, make that into a resolution, and then you could put in a similar manner as prior years, so then because then it's consistent, and we can then work on with that, and that puts that in place and doesn't require us to come back again.
Okay, so the rec is we receive the report, and then we approve a temporary alcohol-free area during the summer period along the coastal strip, along Marine Parade from its intersection with Grove Avenue and Ocean Beach Road and Maranui Street in a similar manner as previous years. That do it, that's B. And then
staff to report back on options in respect of an alcohol control by amendment, taking in particularly in respect of the city centre and Mount Maunganui. Then just effectively puts that into the work program.
report on options. I only got as far as options. You spoke too quickly.
Sorry, options of a bylaw, alcohol control bylaw review with specific focus on the city centre and Mount Maunganui area. And that's effectively picking up on Te Manawa Te Papa and also the city centre action investment plan and the Mount Spatial plan.
Okay, so is someone prepared to move that? Bill, you'll move that, and Shad will second. Anything else? Any other areas you're worried about? No?
Just Chair, in terms of coming back, I have a personal preference for the definitions to be actually included in the bylaw without referring to other legislation. So just some consideration of that also.
Agree. We want to make it as easy as possible for people to find out the information. It's what they need to do. Okay, all right, I'll put that then. All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. So you've got your temporary ban, but a bit more work. Thank you. I'm just a bit worried about my wine bar. Oh. Okay, community, and something easy now, community funding policy.
I'll speak to this in Barbara's absence. She's just doing some other work at the moment. So this has been to you previously and you've provided quite a lot of direction. So it's just taking all of that and turning it into the final policy. It really lays out the concept of a community funding program which pulls together and tells the story of all of the funding sources and purposes, and that's more of a communication document, if anything, for the public so they can get a picture in one place because it's in a number of places, and then sitting underneath that there's a series of policies, being this policy, things like the development contributions policy, etc. They all sit underneath that. And it just makes it easier and also ensures that internally staff who are working on one piece of the funding package have an awareness of the broader funding package, because that was the other thing we were trying to just make sure that staff understood how everything fits together. So that's really, so we weren't going to work through the detail. There is one other matter in terms of just Marae that we was consistent with your direction, but we didn't specifically cover it, and we just wanted to speak to that just so that you understand what we've done in that space, and then really just staff are available to answer any questions.
So on that Marae note, so we've included additional exception to clause 5.1.5 to the revised policy, which basically just enables Marae that's currently considered part of the community to be eligible for funding. And the reason being, following after the meeting in February this year, we became aware that there were certain marae here that are currently considered part of the community but aren't eligible for funding because they technically sit outside the TCC boundary. So we've just included that exception, and Richard's got a bit more detail around that.
That sort of allow a case by case analysis. Is that right? Is that what the exception does?
Yes, but after the Cyclone Gabriel, staff met with the 5 marae that opened their doors, and one of those marae was Te Pito Tarangi marae, and I didn't realise until afterwards, but it was on the wrong side of the road. So effectively it was open sorry, I shouldn't say the wrong side of the road, the other side of the road.
The other side of the road, yes.
So, I mean, that's an example where it was opening its doors for the residents of Tauranga, but under our policy as it stood, they weren't entitled to access community support. So it's really just to address that situation.
So where they're providing services for our community, whether they sit inside our boundary or outside our boundary, they become eligible for funding. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, look, I'm sure we've got a number of questions. I know I have. So, couple of things to clarify. Are sports clubs normally charitable? Do they have charitable status? Are we?
Yes, some of them do. Some can be registered charities, but they don't have to be.
Right. And are we making it? It looks like it looks like we're making them become.
No, so if they want to be eligible for the recommendations, if they want to be eligible for capital funding going forward, that they have to be registered charities. So I think at the moment, there's half of them that have got capital funding approved are registered charities.
Right. So why are we making the other half become registered charities?
So it just provides some more, I guess, accountability assurance. They've got, public records of financial spending, that we've got assurance that the benefit is to the community.
And has that been a problem in the past? Is this a problem we've identified a problem, we're trying to solve it? It's quite an onerous thing to get your charitable status. It puts a lot of administration costs on clubs. So I just want to be sure that we're doing it for a good reason.
It's currently a requirement for to be eligible for a community grant for an organisation to have charitable status, and that includes sports clubs. So we have been approached by sports clubs in the past, and who haven't had that charitable status, and we've said, well, you could be eligible, but you just first have to apply. It's I think and many of them have it's more a time thing rather than a particularly onerous thing. And I guess what it's my understanding of why we've got this charitable status requirement is that it means that there's one process in which there's a level of TCC staff can have a confidence that there's a level of accountability, that they are putting their they're meeting the requirements of the Charitable Purposes Act, and we're not having to go into the nitty-gritty and the details of what their accountability is.
Okay, so it's someone else is doing the checks on them rather than us having to do it. Yeah. Okay. So my next question then is, where you state in the policy that they can only have one go, does that mean that sorry, Wayne, thank you. Our condolences to the family. So does that mean that if, let's say, a sports club is involved with, it's like we're building a multi-use pavilion at Gordon Spratt, and they're one of the sports clubs that's involved with that, and then they approach through the funding mechanism, it's not the matched fund, but the other funding to support running maybe a national under-12 tournament. Does that mean that they wouldn't be eligible for that because they're involved with capital funding?
So the policy clause is that there's a preference for those that don't have funding already. So they can apply, and they're eligible to apply. It just means that if all things are equal, we've got quality applications, it only relates to the community grant fund. So if there are two high quality applications that meet all eligibility criteria, we will preference the one that doesn't already have some sort of funding. So no, it doesn't mean they won't be eligible to apply. They will still be eligible.
Yeah, but it depends on the criteria that you're then going to use for your funding, doesn't it?
If I could just add a couple of examples. We've had examples where people have applied for multiple types of TCC grant, and that just didn't, for the same, exactly the same project. So not for different things, but for the same project. And also a situation where an organisation actually applied for a grant when they were actually funded via a contract for the service as well. And it's really just to try and clarify it. So there's one source of funding per project, not one type of funding per organisation. Yeah.
Right. So that needs to be clearer then, because I understand the problem you're trying to solve, but I just want to create another problem at the same time. And so it would come down to your criteria around your community grant fund, because that doesn't seem to me to be fair. Okay, and then that was the same in your contestable community funding, and then in your multi-year funding agreements. So I'm just thinking of one particular example where I know we give some funding to I'm not sure where the source is, to the Chamber of Commerce. So they get an annual grant an annual grant. And we've set up a similar for the Maori Business Advisory Association, with the sole purpose of trying to build those organisations, both of them, particularly the Maori Business Advisory. I don't think they are called advisory. I think that's the Maori Business Association. Are they multi-year agreements? Is that where they fall under our grant scheme?
Those are actually not within the grant scheme. That's handled by city partnerships at the moment. So there's economic development agreements such as the ones with Priority One and with the Chamber aren't actually included. But it goes back to this idea of the program, that what we really want to do is build this overall picture of where all the support goes out. So we've got one sort of source of the truth. So we want to capture them those, but not actually cover them with the funding policy.
So they will come in and be visible through here?
It's the intention.
In the partnership agreements?
No. Sorry, in the program. So what we're wanting to do, I mean, one of the what this process highlighted for us is that there's a whole lot of different ways that TCC supports organisations, and we really need to build one overall picture of what all that assistance is. So it's the idea of this program that we pull everything in. So we've got one source of truth, one picture on what all that assistance is.
So my question is, where would I see those then?
You would see, well, what we'd be hoping to do is once it's going to be a program of work, but we're able to then be able to say, for example, report back in 12 months' time to the commissioners or to this committee and actually show that overall picture of where the actual assistance is going.
Okay, yep, thank you. So that's me, Stephen, and then Bruce, and then Bill.
Thank you, Chair. My question relates to the community leases, and I'm very pleased to see that they are now being recommended to be included. And I do like the overall theme of having, as you say, the one source of truth. What I'm trying to understand is, under community leases, does that include the ability, say, for a sports club to use a green field? And is that benefit recognised as compared to, say, a basketball court that pay an appropriate rate for the facility? Because this was raised as an issue when we were going through the user fees and charges piece of work, and I know that there is an exercise being commissioned separately to address that question of what's the appropriate balance between fixed facilities and fields. But in terms of having one source of truth, it would be good to actually get a clear understanding. How much benefit does a golf course get, or a rugby field, or a basketball court? And what's the context of all of that, and what's the rationale for all of that?
That's actually beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here. Really, it's the capturing the value of those 150 community leases, which, a lease is really just where there's exclusive use by a club, where there's a fence around it, versus the use of a playing field. That's a separate exercise, but.
Okay. It's a big exercise, but it's a fair question to be answered.
I think the user fee charger of sports fields is something where, and the true cost obviously isn't necessarily recovered through user fees. And so I think that becomes a decision about what proportion is user fee and what proportion is community good. And so I imagine that will be something that we will consider as part of the long-term plan process.
The project and Barbara's team working with finance are currently underway in terms of user fees for community facilities and amenities, including sports fields, and that's coming back to you as part of the long-term plan. So, yeah.
Thank you. Look, totally support the idea of the program. I like the idea of how you're pulling it together. That's good, and I'm appreciative of that. Perhaps it's not. Well, hopefully it's a related question to what you're trying to do, and it was when I got to 5.6, which is decisions on funding, and rather than having a direct question about any of those paragraphs, I'm just wondering whether at this stage there has been thought. Obviously, getting the program together is helpful for community organisations. You are dealing with ratepayer money, and so therefore we need to do it appropriately. Have you had the chance to test check the ease for these groups doing business with council? So I'm trying to think of this from a community group centric perspective. We're going a long way by showing them this is the program, possible options for your group. Have we thought about how coming the other way, how easy it is for them to do business with us? Because obviously you're going to do some due diligence. They're going to have some accountability. Have you thought about that process?
No, it's something where we need to put more time and energy into. We do ask the community grant recipients and the partnership agreement, the current community grant recipients and partnership agreement recipients, just to give us their feedback on how they've found the process. So we do gauge that information at the moment, but that's, I guess, one little fraction of the overall picture. We need to expand what we do. Yeah.
Thank you. It's probably will come through it, but I would be interested, as I've said, to know in the long run, is this helping our community organisations actually access funds and actually be able to deliver the community benefit that we know that they generally do?
Thanks, Chair. My commentary or questions relate to Schedule 4 on page 79 and 80 regarding the partnership agreements. And my sense of it at this stage, we haven't, perhaps in my view, got some of the wording and the balance right, because we're very clearly focusing, and that's fair enough, on the partner organisation obligations. I think there is a bit of work to be done yet in terms of the city council obligations, because we do focus in terms of the partner organisations, in terms of meeting their requirements and objectives. I think we need to have a bit of balancing in terms of then the council, because it's more than just, in my view, a funding application or agreement from the partner. It is the opportunity for the council to use that partner, and whatever partner it is, to undertake particular roles or particular tasks. So I think we need to make some of that clearer, and really that comfort in the organisation over time in terms of using those partnership organisations. It just gives me a sense that the partnership organisation applying for funding without that opportunity of the council to use them. The other thing that probably did raise my eyebrows a wee bit was in terms of we're making it contestable. Well, the proposition is to make it contestable. And I can understand that from one perspective, but I would have thought if we're looking at having agreements with partner organisations throughout the city, we'd be looking at something that was probably more than just a contestability process, but in terms of that relationship development, and actually with an intent to potentially have it more than 3 years. So I'm just raising those concerns. And the other one is it intended to have just one partner agreement for each of the sectors, or is there the potential, given the breadth of some of those sectors, to have more than one per sector?
The proposal was to have one per sector, one cornerstone per sector.
Well, I think, Chair, that even re-emphasises probably my concern in terms of how we go about developing and putting in place these partnership agreements. To be quite frank, I just find that contestability, and if we're looking at something every 3 years, quite clinical. I'm seeing the need for a much more effective relationship in terms of these arrangements.
I think we have had some difficulty communicating what has grown into these partnership agreements. And I think Bill's touching on some quite important issues. And when I read this, I mean, just advocating for council's policies and strategies within the sector. Well, actually, I think of some of the ones that we're partnering with. Actually, it might be more beneficial if we know from that partner whether the council's policies and strategies are not working, rather than have them advocate. I don't see them as advocates for us. I think what we've been trying to enunciate is a relationship whereby they feed, because they are part of a broad sector, that they're another way of us getting good information about what's working out there and what's not. They're a trusted organisation, and I think of the Wednesday Challenge last year when we asked one of our partners, EnviroHub, to come in and help with the oversight of that, because they had that relationship with us, and so somehow we've got to get the essence of those partnerships better defined, and the expectations are on both sides to be contributing to that, rather than the way it's written. It's just we put obligations on them, and then they report to us, and then we'll judge whether they're going to be a partner or not. Actually, both of the partners in a partnership, there's two voices, and so they might not think that the partnership's working either, from their perspective, and we need to hear that, and we need to understand why. So it was, if you go back to when we first set these up, this was a time when this organisation had low trust in the community, and so it was a way of developing relationships in the different sectors that would enable a wider group of people to work alongside of us and develop some confidence in doing so. And as we know, when all the talk about partnerships, it's a give and take, and I don't see any evidence of that give and take in this, and that's why we're struggling in this last couple of years to try and put some words around what it means.
Yeah, look, I think we perhaps need to look at where we're managing those partnerships from. And at the moment, they've been managed through a funding mechanism, community grants and the like, whereas I think we need to think about a much more closer and arguably a contractual relationship with the part of the business responsible for overseeing and delivering services and activities. So if we use EnviroHub, for example, I wonder whether that relationship isn't best managed through our sustainability and waste team, and we have an enduring service for contract or whatever it might be with them, as opposed to this, if you like, this grant approach. So it's almost moving into a service delivery partnership arrangement. We can take the feedback and perhaps rethink about our approach to this. Yeah.
Exactly the answer that I got about the city partnerships, like with Priority One, whom we work with for the economic sector. So it's a different sort of a relationship. And I guess in our heads, the commissioners were thinking similar sorts of relationships with the sector, with the different groups of the sector. And you guys have been struggling with trying to get some words around that to fit into this. It's the old, what is it, round peg in a square hole, or a square peg in a round hole? So that's actually a better way of dealing with those, because they're not agreements, they're relationships. So maybe we take those out.
Yes, I think we can take those out because at the moment, the pool of funds is restricted through this avenue, whereas with business as usual, generally they're funded for activities, outcomes, or projects, and it's through those partnership arrangements that we can.
But in fairness, that's where we started, because if I think back to the long-term plan hearings, they were groups that came in asking for funding to do the work, and we said, let's put them into a partnership. Let's take them out of the grants and put them into a partnership, but they're funded from the grants. Yeah. And sitting in the grants, yeah. And so these guys have been struggling with trying to make that all work, simply because that's where the money is for them. So maybe we need to separate out the partnership funding and.
Yeah, I agree. That can arguably go into the various parts of the business and be managed. The relationship becomes, if you like, an outcome relationship as opposed to a financial transaction.
So, yeah, shared.
I was just, and I had a question in here under issue 4, where it talks about the mayoral fund and service agreements. So this conversation, does that sit in a service agreement kind of type relationship? In terms of these, the partnership, so understanding, our strategic relationship, our strategic objectives, and how that kind of fits together, potentially with these types of partners, would that sit in that frame as a service agreement?
If we made these changes that effectively go from a grant to a, like from the grant funding to a service agreement, as we have with a lot of other NGOs, yeah.
We could add partnership agreements into E, recommendation E2, which is excluding service agreements and mayoral grants from the scope of the community funding policy from the community and from the community funding program. We could do that. Then you just need to tidy up the funding, the money. Yep.
And we've got a long-term plan coming up, which we can probably achieve it through that process.
Because the current 3 years doesn't expire until the long-term plan, that fits fine. So
it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that means we get off these guys' backs trying to get the wording right, because they have struggled with it. Okay, so that. Oh, okay. You're happy to move, right? So that's A through to J. That's all that A through to I.
Just a question for clarification. Do you mean all the current partnership agreements or just the cornerstones? What about 8, 10 at the moment?
We need to look at the whole 8, and then we might make some decisions one way or the other.
So just in terms of the resolution, so then do you want to put B, establishing a community funding program at the end of that sentence, excluding partnership arrangements? So it's clear, because everything in the report includes them. So I think there needs to be something in the resolution to signal that you're asking us to extract that information out of there.
Under B?
Under B, yes. Yeah. And then similarly with I, the exclusion of.
All right, excluding.
Yeah.
Include them in E, and let's have a look at the 8 and make the decision. It's because some of them might go into multi-year, might be better under multi-year agreements. And we have those cornerstone, but we just can't remember the 8 at the moment. Are you moving I, are you? Are you moving J, are you?
No.
Because I'm not going to agree with that. It's H. It's H. Sorry. I just made the comment earlier to the guys that I don't think we have a a commission clinic where one of these applicants doesn't come and talk about. So it is highly political, and I just don't think that you can delegate that overall vision oversight to the chief executive because he doesn't run a clinic.
No, in 12 months' time, it's going to become more political.
Yeah, so if you're moving A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I, J, adding into B, excluding the partnership agreements, and I, and then an E, partnership agreements, and then I don't think we need a resolution, but then we'll have a look at those 8 and decide which ones go where.
And could I just ask a question about H and what its intent was? Because if it wasn't to enable reviewing the schedules and were they still relevant, it raises the question, how do you have a process to review these? Because if it was simply, oh, we've found a problem here and Marty changes in his role as chief executive, what's the review process then if in doing this we find schedules out of date or in some way need to be changed?
The processes will just have to come back for a resolution of whichever committee at that time it would be in the scope of. Yes, we'll sit outside. So it was just to try to make it a little bit more efficient, but we knew it was a bit of a, on balance call. It's not, so we've had some conversations. Yeah. So it's absolutely your direction. And normally you might review these. You would at least look at the quantums when you're doing the LTP, and if there were issues emerging, then the council of the day would probably say we want to have a look at that.
Yeah, I was just trying to think about, I was thinking about the efficiency and whether in fact there would be a natural review period, but I guess given it's excluded and this is going to be on a one-off nature, although logically with the LTP.
So, although we've had several goes at this already, trying to get it right, and that normally comes out of, and that's why I was exploring, whether in trying to solve this problem, you actually create that problem, and that becomes a political decision then. So you normally find out that the system's not quite working right when someone comes and says, we've been getting funding for the last 5 years, and now suddenly we're not. And you find that the chief executive's changed something in the schedule and you have no idea, and then you've got a problem in the community. So you might be better with regular updates, but until you've got a democratic elected council, it might be better that you don't set that in stone, and that's something that they could decide to delegate it out or review it on a regular basis. All right, so we sorted with, are you happy with what's being moved? Do I have a seconder? I haven't got a seconder. Stephen, any further discussion? So how are you happy with the exceptions for Marae? Okay, I'll put that then. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Let's hope we get it right this time, huh? Item number 4, 8.4, retrospective approval of the submission on discussion documents, and it was a review of electricity hazards from trees regulation. Kia ora.
Kia ora. I'm Emma. I've got my colleague Mark, who's the Principal Urban Forester, and just happy to answer any questions that you have. We can take the report as read in the submission.
Yep, we certainly did read it, and you've made the right arguments. We want more trees, not less trees, and we certainly want them in the streets where electricity is. They should put it underground. Shared.
Just a comment as well. I mean, when we're thinking about trees, we need to be thinking about trees in the same way we think about services. So whether it's power, stormwater, roads, and those kinds of things, we do need to be thinking about them. I mean, yeah, provide a lot of benefit. So whether that's shade, ecosystem services, and all those kinds of things. So yeah, I thought it was a really good submission.
Are you moving that shed?
Yep, I'm moving it.
And you're happy to second? Yep. Okay, everyone happy? All those in favour? Against? Carried. Well done. Thank you. Well, yeah. Okay, how's it going? Dashboard. Come on up, Alistair.
Thanks. With some help from Rory, who's just about to join us. So brief background, and then Rory, I'll get you to set the screen up so folks can have a look. The question in front of us was whether or not the gap between affordability and availability of housing could be told in a more visual way. The challenge we have is that we know that the city is going to experience demand, but how do we tell that story? So Rory was given the challenge of coming up with a visual format for that. And with some help from Stephen, we're going to have a quick look through, starting with Rory, showing a few different versions of the challenge the city has ahead.
Thanks, Alistair. I'm just going to wait until I can share my screen on the Zoom call. I believe we're having technical difficulties in real life for once. So. Sorry. All right, yes, thanks, Alistair. So basically, what this dashboard is all about is telling that story of the challenges that Tauranga is facing in the housing world in a dynamic and succinct way. So a couple of assumptions underlying this. So this is all based on two papers, so the 2022 Smart Growth HBA survey and the Tauranga Dwelling Review, which are available upon request. One other thing in this dashboard, I refer a little bit to maximum capacities of things like greenfield areas and things like wards. So that is a very high level assumption that is behind that. So it's based on things like infrastructure capacity and space capacity. And that is kind of looking out to what we could achieve in 150 years. So that is to be taken with a pinch of salt. But what is not to be taken with a pinch of salt really is the situation that we're seeing at the moment in regards to housing supply versus demand. So that graph on the right there is really showing every 5 years for the next 30 years, what is housing supply like in comparison to housing demand. And you can see in that big call out box to the left of it, that we're about 5,000 houses down on where we should be to meet overall demand. And that graph on the right shows that that gap does not close. If anything, it widens as we go over the next kind of 5, 10, 15 years. It does start to close a little bit based on the forecast that we've got if we get to 2050. But even then, we're still looking at about a 5,000 dwelling shortfall. If we scroll down here, the little speedometer, what that is doing is it's looking at, based on the chosen year, what is current capacity, what is the current number of dwellings versus how many we could feasibly have in that ward if it was properly maxed out, so all the infrastructure in place, all the space being utilised as well as possible. There's a little glitch actually here. If you haven't chosen a ward, it tells you you're in Arataki, but actually it's looking at Tauranga as a whole. So if we do choose a ward, so if we say, let's have a little look at Mount Maunganui. So in 2023, so currently, we've got just over 5,500 dwellings in that ward. And if all was maxed out, we could achieve about 8,500 in that ward. And you'll see as we change that date in the top left, so at the moment we're in 2023, but we could say what's going to happen in 20 years' time in 2043. And hopefully you'll see that little speedometer just eke out a little bit. So you can see, yes, we're starting to utilize some more of that capacity, but we've still got a bit of room there to develop. And I think that's the main thing that this dashboard is trying to do. It's not just saying it's doom and gloom, it's a disaster, we've got this massive housing gap. It's also trying to to point out these areas where maybe if there was more investment, if more utilization could be made, this is where we could start to squeeze that gap. So this visualization down here in the bottom left is seeking to do that as well. So this is just looking at greenfield dwelling potential. So you've got those 4 greenfield areas on the left. So you've got Keenan, Haiti, Taruko, and Te Tumu, which have been HBA approved. And you can see the blue bar versus the orange bar is how full it is compared to the overall capacity. And then those 4 on the right, so Merrick Road, Upper Belk, Domain, and Upper Joyce, those are potential areas. So they haven't been HBA approved, but you can see, especially with Merrick and Upper Belk, the capacity there is that potential space. So if we have a look at 2053, we can see, okay, these HBA approved greenfield areas, they're like kind of coming close to capacity, but there's those 4 on the right which aren't being utilized at all based on this current plan, this current forecast from that HBA review. And again, this is maybe one of the areas that could be utilized if we really want to tackle the housing problem in Tauranga. So that's kind of the high level view. We've got a second tab as well, which is, it's kind of a zoom in on that graph on the top right, looking at forecast supply versus demand. But what's added on top of this is the number of CCCs and building consents we've got coming through. So that's actually the new houses that we've got available, these new dwellings boosting the ranks of Tauranga. And you can see we do not have a lot of data yet because this has been the first time we've done this kind of exercise. But hopefully in 5-10 years time, if we look back at this, we'll be collecting that data over the years and you can really start to track the accuracy of that forecast. And you can really see how good have we been at judging how much capacity we're going to have. And hopefully, how good are we going to be at closing that gap between forecast supply versus demand? That's pretty much it. So any questions?
Really, that's really good. Thank you for that. The question I have is when you're doing your additional housing, is that what densities? How are you judging that extra availability? What are you using for that? What metrics?
So this was all done by the strategy team. So this is, I've just kind of been displaying the data, and the assumption that's behind that is it's looking at a mixture of actual space that there is in each of the greenfield areas or the wards, and the infrastructure around that as well that would be able to satisfy the number of dwellings that would be able to be built, that maximum number.
So it's based on the infrastructure.
It's based on the space and the infrastructure, the
The
feasible number of dwellings you'd be able to provide.
So Christine, is that taking into account the MDRS from the space available?
So through the MDRS, we've re-looked at how many houses we can accommodate, and that's included in the report that goes to the hearing panel. But it is tempered by things like covenants, stormwater, natural hazards, those sorts of things. So even though the MDRS layer is across the whole city, we know the uptake won't be across the whole city because some areas have got barriers or constraints that won't be picked up. So that's all taken into account.
So that's all in here.
These have come off the latest stuff from APS. Yep.
Great, that's really good. Oh.
Yeah, great information. And certainly I went in last night to the TCC website. So there is an existing housing dashboard there, which has a whole lot of great trend information covering all of the housing elements, whether that's social, market-led, whatever. And I presume this will go on the website. Just wanting to be sure that there's the connection and joining up, that we're not having it somewhere separate, so that when people go in, you can actually get a whole raft of information on housing that is connected. So I just wanted to make that comment, Chair.
I think that's a good point. The initial time when we looked at the challenge was whether we actually had the data in the first place. And then secondly, who was the right audience for this? So yes, there are ratepayers who'd be interested in this, but we were initially intending that when we're talking to other agencies, that we could quickly show the gap and why there was a need to put Tauranga first. on some of those matters, but we can definitely look at putting it up as well.
So I just had a couple of questions. So, yeah, I really love the tool, and I've been had a scoot around on the Vital Updates previous iteration, and similar platform, great information, and to help inform our decisions. The question I had really around the wards. So that's based on ward. Can you drop down into individual mesh blocks?
So we do have the data to do that. Just in this visualization, we were trying to keep it quite high level, just for that real kind of, this is the headline view. But if you wanted to drill down into it, we do have it by mesh block as well. Okay.
And then my next question is, so this gives us a really good picture of Tauranga City. Would be useful for us to share this, I think, with our partners, so they've kind of got a clear view of what we're dealing with, and then whether there's an opportunity for like Western Bay to do the same or apply the same, so we get a broad sub-regional picture of the gap.
Through the development trends report, they do all this is basically taking the data from the development trends report and from our growth projections. So Western Bay do the same. It's just a way of presenting the information. So I mean, we could show them the tool and they could adopt the same. All the data's there. Yeah.
Thanks, Rory, and thanks for the excellent work you've done on this. And I know that between you, Alistair, and myself, we had lots of conversations around what was possible. And I'd like to say that this is a start, because what it does is graphically show the significance of the issues that we're facing. But there's a whole bunch of information that we would love to present, but I know, Rory, you had real difficulties in getting reliable data, and that is the issues around both on the potential side. There are a whole bunch of factors that relate to, the capacity of each one of those wards, be it infrastructure, be it the market, and their willingness to actually pick up opportunities, the whole funding challenges that will inevitably result in the potential of each area being either realised or not, as the case may be. And then on the on the demand side, the question really is around, okay, so that's the gross number, but how many houses do we need over $1 million? How many houses do we need under $1 million? And what's the supply and demand gap by tenure, by type, rental versus ownership, and all that subsequent detail. And that's really the nub of the problem. So what this does is graphically presents the challenge in front of us, but actually in terms of fixing the challenge, it's not much use providing $5,000 million homes. We might actually get the number of supply right, but they might all be empty. So really, there's a need for us to really think about how we might address those wider understanding, or the deeper understanding of how we actually fix the problem. But I do think this is a powerful tool just in showing the size of the problem. And I would be keen, as Shad has suggested, to have the data include the wider sub-region, because that's really what we're dealing with from a smart growth point of view. And some time ago, I did, I think, get a resolution passed that we have I described it as a cricket worm of house supply, which is kind of what that is. You can see what the required run rate is, and you can see what your batting rate is. And so I think timely and regular reporting of those issues is fundamental, because we've got to keep it right in front of all stakeholders across the spectrum. Thanks, Chair.
I'm aware that Smart Growth is developing exactly that, but given that Smart Growth's leadership group only meets 4 times a year, I think the tool that you're talking about probably needs to be come to TCC more often than that, because as you say, that's the critical thing that we're constantly focused on. Christine.
So I was just going to say exactly what you've said, that yes, it is being picked up through smart growth. So much of what you're asking for has been done through the housing and business assessment, and then will come through the updated smart growth strategy. But we could report it when we do our regular growth reporting.
Yeah.
So we bring that to here.
Yeah.
So all the project reporting, so then you could put the data with that if that's helpful.
And that would be the logical thing, rather than, because then you're able to have, as we know, smart growth has representatives of the council sitting there, but it's more important. It's equally as important from a sub-regional point of view, but also at a TCC table, so that you can, as TCC, be talking about what is it that you're doing and what effect is it having and where is the gap, etc., etc.
I agree, and particularly when you're starting to look at the graph that shows consents versus CCCs, and you can start to get a feel of whether or not that's trending in the right direction or not, as the case may be.
Andy, and I think that's workable. He's listening online.
And I think we can introduce this tool to that other housing forum and encourage it to be adopted as a sub-regional tool.
It gives you that high level, and then you dive down into it, ward by ward or area by area would be. Yep. Well done.
Thanks very much.
Shad. Oh, Raharu. Sorry.
Sorry. Thank you for your presentation. A lot of my questions have been answered, such as like who the dashboard is for, and the impacts on infrastructure and water supply in the area, and whether that was also included in data. But I do think that if Te Pio was here, he'd probably ask around Māori land, and I received an email earlier this morning passing on his apologies, kia ora. And really it comes down to, like, if there's an opportunity to drop down another level to look at Māori land and provide, click a button and have that information on the dashboard, that will be really helpful for especially our Māori housing sector.
Yeah, definitely. So what we could do is we could just whack a button in, you could press it, and you could say, you know what, we don't care about the wards, we just want to see those Maori areas, and you could have the functionality to do that.
I think that's quite important, Chair, that functionality, because over time the wards potentially will change. So it's about making sure we're not losing anything in that process.
Well done. Well done. Good problem solver.
Yeah,
okay. So the attachment is going up on the
Minutes.
It'll be in the minutes web page. Okay. So we're just receiving the report. Thank you, Stephen. And Bill second. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you. Thanks, Rory. Okay, infrastructure resilience program.
Kia ora tātou, and while Natalie and Kim take their places, I thought I'll just go through a quick introduction. The purpose of this paper is to give an update on where we are with the resilience suite of works as we go through the LTP process. This is not a final version of where that will land, but it gives a bit of an outline of the thinking that goes into how we want to de-risk the resilience component of our work. It still needs to go through the executive and the council final approvals, but I hope we've sort of given the committee here an idea of what our thinking is, how we've ranked it, and where we've ended up. Yeah, so this is the first cut, and we've obviously had a big program in the resilience space over the last 10 years or so. And we talked about that after the anniversary flood and Gabrielle, etc. And although we had some significant issues around the city, but we did fare quite well because of the significant work that's gone into particularly stormwater management over the last decade. And then in 2017, the infrastructure resilience program started under CJ's oversight, and quite sort of sector leading work, I think, in terms of mapping the hazards, and we have a very good picture of, depending on regardless rather of what the hazard is, we've got a really good picture of the risks around the city. As infrastructure is taking over, we've gone through those projects, ranked them in order of priority, and we started with 320 projects in total. 130 of them have dropped out for whatever reason, either scoring really low or actually just been folded into business as usual. As we do renewals or upgrades, it's just going to happen anyway. And in the LTP, we've landed on a focus for bridges at about $40 million and waters for about $20 million. And those 20 are going to be spent over the next couple of years. And beyond that, it then, as the LTP assumes that there'll be an entity in place after the 2 years. So that's sort of the lead up to where we're at to this point. And I'll hand over to Kim and Natalie.
Hi, thank you for having me here. I think Nick's given a good overview there. So just to let you know, I guess it's an update of where we're up to with the resilience part of the Resilience and Sustainability Project. We've had, in the previous LTP, there were 5 projects identified, and of them, 4 of them have continued on. The Chapel Street Bridge is still ongoing, as with the European Joyce water treatment plant supply trunks, and the raw water project has been moved out to allow time for, there was some consenting issues. The Tauranga Hospital Slope Stability Project, it was one of those ones where it identified some issues, but that could actually be done through renewals anyway, so it didn't need the separate funding from the resilience project. And then obviously the Cambridge Reservoir Trunk Mains is a project that started in this LTP but has been proposed for the next LTP. The other part of the projects that we've been doing is just looking at the data that goes behind the decisions that the risks are based on. So as we go forward, the hazard data is always changing. There's new science, housing changes, the water changes, groundwater table changes. And so we're feeding that into the project as we go as well. So it's probably to help explain why the projects are changing for the proposed LTP is that everything keeps changing and we have to adapt to it as well. And as we go forward, the infrastructure is being done as BAU by other people in council, or the transport and the waters team. So then that changes some of the projects that were proposed at the start of the resilience project initially. So that was one of the main reasons that these change, and also some of the projects were removed, like Nick said. Some of them became more operational rather than actually CapEx spend as well. And I think one of the reasons we sort of decided to focus on that bridge aspects, it's not necessarily just the bridges, but it's the causeways and the lead ups as well. There's a lot of projects that go around, looking at the resilience of our transport networks, but these bridges are key aspects in that they provide connections to the communities, to especially sort of in Matua area, it's that whole peninsula out by itself there. But also they have been identified on the Wakakotahi Resilience portal as well. So not those ones particularly, but the Turret Road Bridge has, and also the causeway leading up to Chapel Street Bridge and then over to the Harbour Bridge. So they've been identified on the Wakakotahi website for seismic issues, and also tsunami and storms. So it's not just what we've identified, but also been identified by Wakakotahi as well as these areas that we need to look at to provide this resilient network through our city. That's probably about it. So if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you very much. I don't think you should be afraid of being dynamic. That's the world we live in, and I would be worried if you weren't changing the program based on things that are happening every week. It seems there's new information or there's a new hazard, or so it's good to see. And I think it's good to have an update, because especially at the moment, a lot of the queries are coming from the public about what the council is doing. Are we thinking about it? And of course, it's one of the areas where a lot of work has actually happened in the past. And although we haven't had the weather bullets that particularly the East Coast has had, the heavy rain and the sodden and the continuous rain, I think we've had almost 12 months of rain. Most of our systems are coping with it, and the incidents are quite isolated, tragic, and really hard to deal with when it's it hits your family. But fortunately, compared to others, we're looking at a small number of families that have been affected seriously, and that just means we've just got to keep on with the program. We've just got to keep on adapting and mitigating, and as you say, changing. So well done. Any questions, Stephen?
Thanks for the report. I totally agree with your sentiments about receiving the update, because I think it highlights the really important work that you and your team are doing to make sure that we understand our risks and we are managing and investing to manage those as best we can. A couple of questions, if I may. The landslide information on paragraph 20 highlights quite a significant risk to properties. What's the process for reporting that? And then I guess, what's the implications of that process? Because I would imagine there will be quite considerable concern around that. And my second question relates to the risk assessment that's done. When it says, say, 80%, it says a risk assessment of 80, is that 80% or is it, yeah. So those are my two questions, thanks.
Whereabouts is for your second question, is it in the?
On the table it says current risk rating 75 or 80, or I noticed one was at 100. Is that out of?
Yeah, no, sorry, that one. Yep. I'll answer your first question first. In terms of the citywide landslide study, at the moment it's going through a QA. So it's an update of the data that we already have, but because the topography the data is a lot better now than it was in 2000. So where it says 5,000 properties have been affected, it's not necessarily additional. It's that the actual slope hazard could have been removed from those properties, but there is a number that have been added, and they're in areas that were formerly outside of the Tauranga city boundary in 2000. So currently they have no slope hazard data for them. And so it will be, when the information's available, we'll go through the process of reporting to council, and then obviously a letter dropped to those affected residents and being available to speak to them should they have any queries. But for the majority, it is a data update, a landslide data update. And in terms of the risk numbers, the risk numbers there's a matrix behind it. The highest number is 125. I'm not entirely sure why the highest number is 125, but that's the way it is. So it goes from 0 to 125, and 125 is the highest level of risk. I don't know why it's not 100, but that was what was used previously. And so when you're looking at the numbers, if it says 80, it's 80 out of 125. So it's quite high compared to, say, 25 or something.
These signals, we've got a few quite significant risks which we have to pay attention to.
Yeah. And on from that, so a letter drop to those people and conversations with them, and then does the information go on their LIM?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm on page 132, and this is the wastewater resilience at Beach Road. The current risk rating is 100, and then post mitigation it's down to 75. I take it from that whatever we do there, and given the location of that, it's going to carry on as a potential significant risk.
Yes, that's correct. So it's one of those ones that no matter what you do, the risk won't go down. However, I know in that area that there is alternative wastewater treatment proposed that may end up mitigating that project itself. But in that area, for the wastewater, the pipes need replacing. I think a significant portion of them are asbestos pipes.
Learned is that bridges, we tend to tack everything onto bridges, all our services onto bridges, and including communication and power and wastewater. And if the bridge goes out, it's not only your ability to get from one place to another, but you lose all your services as well. So that's a new risk that has just developed, really, or the severity of that risk, really, in these recent storms. Although some councils have known about their water along 7 bridges for quite some time. Chad, and then Bruce. Sorry, Bruce.
Just a couple of questions, just in terms of these transport projects. So the Chapel Street, the Matua, and the Turret Road. I assume we would attract some waka kotahi funding, FAR funding associated with those projects.
Yes, absolutely.
And with Turret Road, the alignment with a long-term solution. So we're dealing with the resilient stuff and just wanting to understand, we'll make sure that we're kind of aligning whatever we do from a resilience perspective dovetails into the long-term solution. And I think IFF would kind of link into that as well.
Yeah, that's right, and there is a resilience component to the business case that's being put together. So it's all woven into the overall long-term solution for it.
Thank you again for, as I would reflect, a very important and interesting report. Just, and not to be totally enamoured with numbers, even if we're going to 125, in your risk matrices, what's an acceptable risk? So when I mean, obviously Bill's pulled out the resilience for Beach Road and it goes down to 75, which still sounds quite high. In terms of the matrices or the heat map, what's acceptable? Is 30 a good number? I mean, it's better than 40, but is it a good number is what I'm trying to say.
I don't think there was a number for acceptable risk in the matrices. There is what they call, and I didn't put it in here actually, and it probably was quite relevant, is there's an improvement factor. So it takes into account the pre-risk and then post-risk, following the mitigation. So that actually shows you the value of what you're doing. But no, there was no discussion over acceptable risk. And I think in terms of like academics, acceptable risk is different to different people as well. So, but obviously a green colour would be nice rather than bright red.
Yeah. Perhaps I'm just attracted by colour rather than numbers. But actually that's the whole point, isn't it? We are sustainable. And I'm just trying to sort of say, so we invest the zillions of dollars into this. That's a technical term. And are we, well, we must be by definition more sustainable, but are we in a defensible position going forward? I think that's what I'm trying to get. No worries.
No, that's a good point and something that I'll look into to see if there is within those reports something on acceptable risk. I think we were just always looking for what would give us the highest improvement factor. So even if the risk was not going to change too much, it was whether we're going to get that good improvement.
I think that's where the country is actually going as well, given recent events, because there will be, as you say, you could invest zillions of dollars and the risk is still there. If you build a community on a river flat or a floodplain, the risk is enormous. You could build a lot of infrastructure and put a lot of money into it. As we're seeing now, the rural sector are having to come back and increase the height of their stop banks because the flood brought down a whole lot of silt, and suddenly you've got a different height level. So depending on circumstances, when there is no, it's more about when you decide what risks you are prepared to take rather than what is an acceptable number. Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, just for clarification, like any risk work we do, it's a combination of likelihood of consequence, and you may have something that's very likely to happen with a low consequence, but because of the likelihood of it happening, you might actually want to invest in that earlier than you invest in something that's got a very low probability but a high consequence. And so there's a bit of judgment around that. And I guess that's why we use a matrix where you end up with red, orange, and green sort of thing. And I guess we haven't drawn that acceptability line yet because we're just starting at the top. If we had all the money in the world, we might have to look into it. But I think it's a good next step actually to say what is acceptable to us in terms of likelihood and consequence in a matrix.
I wonder if I could.
From an asset point of view, though, that we're talking from an asset point of view, not a people point of view.
Well, I'm not. I think I've probably gone to dominate, but I actually think in the long run, like somewhere, what is acceptable needs to be, dare I say it, a commission or a political decision. I don't mean that because I don't deny the work you guys are doing, but somewhere there needs to be either a consensus between governments and management as to what actually is that acceptable risk. And I'd like to think that would occur. And I would also presume that actually you look at this from a total network perspective, not just an individual asset perspective. But anyway, that's my thought. Sorry, Christine.
I was just going to come up. I think the discussion when it gets to it will be actually not just about public sector assets like our infrastructure. It will actually be private sector assets as well, which is the whole, do you do managed retreat? Do you mitigate and defend? And at what point do you actually say, in these circumstances, we'll run these assets, both public and private, to the end of their useful life, but they're not going to be replaced. And so you do like a whole life cycle planning, and you're really saying in 50, 60, 80 years, actually this area won't be as it is anymore. So I think those are, and once some of that national direction comes out, that's when we can start to have some of those broader conversations, and it's things like electricity as well and communications, that everybody's in the same boat. Yeah.
Just following on from Bruce's line of questioning, do you have an example of what a 0% risk rating looks like?
No, I can't think of. I don't think any of them had 0. But
I see Matua Bridge gets post mitigation down to a 4, which is probably the lowest. But yeah, it would be good to know because it is quite depressing seeing these numbers.
Yeah.
But just seeing what are the 0 ones and whether we are actually doing okay, and that just backs up what Bruce has been talking about as well. Kia ora.
On the Napier Hill, which was pretty bedrock, but even that I don't think was 0 because we lost it. Part of it wasn't bedrock, and the construction wasn't right, and we lost a nurse's home, and several people were killed in the 31 earthquake. So I don't know what 0 would look like. I was just saying the Matua Bridge at an 18-metre tsunami would take that out too.
Just to add, and this risk matrix is specifically designed for risk against natural hazards. So not all our assets will be on this one. There might be other assets that's got operational risks associated to it. So just to note that may be why it come down, because you've mitigated for that natural risk against natural hazards.
Okay, and if you think this is hard, then try moving people out of an area that is deemed to be high risk or extraordinary high risk. It's not easy. Okay, so we need a resolution to receive the report and the executive. Thank you, Stephen and Rohario, second. So that feeds into the long-term plan discussions. Okay. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Interesting discussion. Okay, Mount Te Arataki Spatial Plan update. Comes Carl. Welcome, Carl.
Morena.
You been based over in the Mount, or are you backwards and forwards between?
Backwards and forwards, yeah. Still need a bunch of other projects underway as well, so yeah. So yeah, kia ora koutou. So this project, we're talking around both the Mount Spatial Plan and the Mount Industrial Planning Study today. David was, due to another commitment, isn't able to make it, but I should be able to answer most questions. Now I can provide a bit of a summary and emphasise some of the key points, if you like.
Yep, thank you.
Sure. Okay. So the Mount Spatial Plan seeks to deliver a 30-year blueprint that provides strategic direction for existing and future community needs as the area continues to grow. The Mount Industrial Planning Study is being prepared at the same time, and we're working closely together to push both projects forward. The purpose of the industrial study is to plan for the future of that industrial area and identify a program of actions which considers the key issues of that area, but also responds to the needs of all stakeholders. So initial engagement was undertaken with the community in March and April, and it's taken us probably a bit over a month to summarise that, because we did get really good feedback. We got 960 survey responses, and if you think there's probably sort of 20 odd questions in that survey, it's a high level of response. But almost 75% of the people who responded were from the Mount Spatial Plan area, and I think that's a really good outcome. So the numbers are good there. And as well as that, we had our drop-in sessions and so forth. So we had over 10,000 comments in the end that we had to bring together. More recently, we have run our design sprint workshops with our subject matter experts, mana whenua, and our reference group, our project partners. So we had 30 people in the room for 3 days to really move forward in terms of some of the key direction that we want to take. We're also engaging directly with mana whenua representatives through a series of wānanga and hui. So that's running concurrent to all of our other design workshops, but also with them directly involved in the workshops. And our next wānanga is this Wednesday with mana whenua. So I think I'll just touch briefly on some of the key engagement outcomes and the direction things are heading, and then open it up for questions. So we got good response overall, through the surveys, but certainly transport, parks and open space, and healthy and safe communities were highest on the agenda for people responding. And some of the key themes that were coming out: a desire for more public amenities like rubbish bins, toilets, showers, seating, barbecues, kind of a little bit back to basics, they want to see that. Also, I just added in road maintenance. That keep coming up. So people are really, I guess, keen to see the basics done well, and that's coming back loud and clear. Maintaining access to the beach while preserving the coastal environment, safer roads, separated cycle and pedestrian infrastructure, traffic calming. A lot of this is around perceived and actual safety, the feedback we're getting. Crime reduction and personal safety, particularly around the Bayfair and Arataki area. So that's coming through stronger from that community. Parking and accessibility is a key area of feedback, managing congestion, and also risk around natural hazards, climate change. So I don't think any of these themes are new to you, but when you take those 10,000 comments, this is the stuff that is floating the top that we're hearing the most. And it's pretty consistent with, I think, what we've heard through, long-term plan feedback previously and other areas which we've taken into account as well. So in terms of where I guess things are, the evolving direction as we're calling it, and it's really just a snapshot and this is really a snapshot of both community or the outcomes of that design sprint workshop, but taking into account the feedback from mana whenua, the community, our key stakeholders, and our subject matter experts. So that support for growth around centres, so people see the merits in that growth. They want to be connected and enjoy the ability to connect to their centres and have amenities and so forth in walking distance or bicycle or close driving distance. Recognising the inherent differences between communities. So the Mount Downtown community is a different community from Omanu and is a different community from Arataki and is a different community from Whareroa. And that comes through strong in our community feedback, but it's also recognised by our experts as well. And it is something that we need to be wary of and emphasise and respond to with the right actions. Protection of the environment. For Arataki and Bayfair, community focus on maintenance and safety, local area planning, enhancing local and wider movement connections, supporting growth of the area over time, supporting the area over time so that as growth occurs, it occurs in a sustainable way and addresses those fundamental sort of base issues. For Central Monganui Road Corridor, so this area is, it's really that Monganui corridor between the Mount and between Arataki and thinking about Monganui Road and that stretch of residential between. There was a lot of discussion around maximising the multimodal function of that corridor, looking at how we buffer that industrial area. And I think what we're talking about there is land use, but other ways as well, potentially softening that boundary. But then we still need to get those cross connections because that is where people work and want to connect with. And supporting local connected centres. So people really do value their centres. And I spoke to a couple of people who said, there's the little shops down Omanu, how can we get those operating more as a neighbourhood centre? So people want to be able to access those. Second to last, the Mount Industrial Area, investigating regulatory and non-regulatory tools to enhance existing and future environmental quality. So some of the direction that's coming up is an environmental accord with businesses, and that is coming through strongly with the discussions we're having with those key stakeholders. They are willing and open to moving forward in that direction. Landscape treatment, stormwater treatment, stream restoration, looking at buffering of areas between the sensitive uses, so Whareroa community, for example, the residential areas and how we might further buffer those areas from the industrial. And I think that's in its broadest context, acknowledging some of the, some of the polluting or the emitting industries, but also acknowledging noise, movement, and those sort of outcomes. And there has been a lot of discussion around amenity, and that perception of amenity is important. And in discussing introduction of lighter industrial to support progressive change, particularly where those interfaces occur and how we might manage that, but acknowledging the existing use rights exist. And last but not least, that culture and identity. And I think that comes through strongly at a number of levels, working with mana whenua in terms of displaying and illustrating that culture and heritage, but also for the more recent history and the place that has always been that holiday home, beach vibe, people walking down the road with their surfboards and so forth. And both of those stories need to come through and come through strong. In terms of next steps, we are currently preparing for engagement, which will start on the 11th of September. So that's really taking out the key actions and ideas and key moves that are coming out of the work to date. So we'll go out and engage with the community key stakeholders through that month of September, and then moving into refining and bringing back to yourselves a draft plan for consideration, which will be along the lines of spatial plans to date. However, I do think what we'll see in this is a stronger policy context as we respond to some of those key land use issues in the area. Happy to take any questions.
Carl, So there's no real surprises coming through. Those are some of the continuation of some of the issues that have come to us really over the last 2 years, which is good. You know, that's good that there isn't something really out of left field. I've got a couple of questions. I have to say I was astounded to see, particularly the schools, the fears, that the perception of the lack of safety. And when you look on page 69, where you've got your response from schools about walking instead of taking a car, fear of strangers is 35%, road safety and crossing busy streets is 25%, fear of dogs off leash is 15%, and then preference for walking during daylight hours is 10%. So you're left with 15% confidence to walk around your streets. That's pretty dire for young people, because that, you know, they're the ones that we actually want to be encouraging to be using those different modes of travel. And we appreciate that some of that is always perception, and they pick it up from adults. But that's a bit of a scary stat. When you talk about the centres, you're talking about the Mount, and you're talking about Bayfair, Arataki. It's interesting to see Omanu then coming through as another centre, and I don't think we'd pick that up in Plan Change 33.
Plan Change 33 does pick up the Manu Tweed Street area there as a centre. Yes, local centre, as I understand.
Local centre. Yep. Okay. And then my other question is, with your reference group, I was surprised that you didn't have, because those are sort of the specialists that you talk about. I was surprised that you didn't have the Mount Business Association in there. I would have thought that they would be pretty key stakeholders to have in with that other group.
So no, we don't have them on the reference group. Probably the decision there was that they sit, particularly, I guess, in that one community of the Mount downtown area. However, we are undertaking specific engagement with them, which includes workshops with them to input directly into the process. So they are getting equivalent airtime per se.
Okay. And the other just interesting thing was to see proposed bus lanes being used by trucks. I was watching this morning in Hewlett's. It's not a bad suggestion.
Well, what I've noticed too is along Monganui Road, where we're actually creating that, if you like, that more residential, sedate experience on the road. We're still seeing large, heavy vehicles, logging trucks use that, and actually, it's quite a conflict. And I was just thinking that I know Hopi has a bylaw that channels, the heavy vehicles through an alternate route. And I just wonder, as part of what we've created there, shouldn't we be looking to do the same?
Sure, and I think so. A key part of this process is working really closely with the Connecting Mount Monganui team. So in terms of us being able to communicate the outcomes of this, the type of place we want to create, and feeding into that process. So I'll jot that down and take it away.
Lastly, when we know that Maranui and Ocean Beach Road are our main arterial, other than the Eastern Link, through from Papamoa to the Mount, and we know that that's a very expensive property to try and extend that in any way. But coming through is that multimodal, that desire for cycleways, separated, safe cycleways. So are you looking at trying to use then some of our back streets? So I understand Christchurch has done that quite well, where it disappears into through the suburbs alongside, if you like, rather than try and do something on quite a narrow piece of road that it's impossible to get any greater width for a sensible amount of money.
So in terms of the outcomes and direction we're taking and through the design sprint, I think the common messaging is to be looking at those streets, the routes that you're talking to, the north-south routes, and looking at those for walking and cycling. But we will work with the Accessible Streets project team, and the final detail, I guess, where those connections land will be with that team, but we'll provide clear direction in terms of the outcomes sought in that regard.
Sorry about the Accessible Streets team are very focused on moving into the curb area on those arterials, which is hellishly expensive. And every time I bring up Wellington's trial with Wakakotahi, I hit a brick wall, because I think we've got to think of some more economic alternatives and making better use of our side streets, which are residential streets with 2,000 to 2,500 vehicles a day, which is much, much safer for cycling than.
Yeah, the message has been received, and we'll be climbing into this to make sure that any work going on in that area at the moment considers alternate options for creating the same outcome. Yeah.
Totally agree with your the comments that you just made, because cycling on an arterial is not a particularly nice place to be anyway, let alone the safety issues associated with it. The thing that really struck me, looking through the detail, was the amount of sentiment around public transport, walking and cycling. There's a question on page 73, better transport making it easier to get around was the heart of the question. 30% spoke of public transport improvements, 22% spoke of bicycle pedestrian-friendly initiatives, 4% spoke of reducing traffic and environmental impact, 2% on safety. So if you add all those up, they're about 60% of the response, and only 34% spoke of improved road infrastructure and traffic management, and surprisingly, only 8% spoke of parking. And I just sort of reflect on every time we do a bus lane or cycle lane, the wave of opposition that comes through to any of that kind of. So we've clearly got a conflict, I think, between those who want to move through an area and those who live there. And often the sentiment of those who live there isn't heard. Well, it's come through really loud and clear in this spatial plan. Fascinating, I think. But also, I think it does raise the question, does the behaviour match the sentiment? Because I suspect the majority of mode for all of those people who live in Arataki Mount is still predominantly car.
Sentiment that is coming through is that it's a beach, it's more of a beach vibe, and so you can understand why they're wanting that, because you're more inclined to cycle or walk because it's pleasant and you're alongside the sea. Except when I'm going to work and I want to be able to zip down Ocean Beach Road or through Lynx Ave or the fastest way.
I mean, I totally agree in terms of what you're saying, and we do find, it was the same through the Te Papa Spatial Plan, the Watamaitai Spatial Plan, and in this one, there is a general, we feel, support for walking, cycling, and so forth. And I do think when you get down to the detailed plans and that it is starting to affect somebody's road, that you're more likely to draw out those people in direct response. So I think it does need that. This is a community view, whereas when you are getting down to those particular projects, you're probably getting an affected person's view.
So with Lynx Ave, where it was the through traffic, it was those that were using it that were most upset and are still out there, lined up nose to tail along Ocean Beach Road. We've just moved the problem down into Ocean Beach Road. Bruce.
Yes, I probably fair to ask a question in this area, which is not at all my specialty. But what I'm interested in understanding is how easy is it to land the Mount Industrial Spatial Plan? No, so my issue should really declare an interest given my Bay of Plenty regional council interest. So I'm obviously got a concern about air quality, but I'm thinking here about actually the problem which is consistent around the country, where you have got industrial buffering up against residential, and I mean, for instance, to land the MIPS, do you need to have the environmental accord you've talked about with business? How do you go about finalising this in a way that's acceptable to parties? And I may be showing ignorance about spatial planning, but you can correct me on that as well. Thanks.
I think it's a very fair question. Won't be a easy task, and it will take time. It will require partnership between ourselves, regional council, priority one, other key stakeholders, and the businesses. I think it will need to be an amalgam of responses, such as environmental accord, a voluntary environmental accord, as well as looking at policy changes within that area to achieve change over time. And that process or potentially the outcomes we're seeking may not be acceptable to all parties, and we'll need to work through that. So, I see the spatial plan as pointing in the direction that we need to traverse and clearly outlining what the next steps are and informing, I guess, our ongoing work program into, end of this year, next year to I guess, move forward with more detailed studies and understanding of the tools that we would use, and then moving towards, what those tools are, whether they are, as I say, environmental accord, other non-regulatory tools, as well as regulatory tools such as plan changes.
Thanks, Bruce. That was a very good segue in terms of, and I really want to follow on that same theme, Carl, in terms of, in particular, in respect of the Mount Industrial Planning Study, in terms of where your thinking is and what you're picking up to date, is how definitive the recommendations or the direction and recommendations from that study. And if I just use an example, you've referenced environmental accord with businesses. So generally at a high level, but how specific is it going to burrow down in terms of other recommendations that can then be picked up for implementation in one form or another? And I suppose the concern is that we do a plan and there's a whole lot of recommendations about further plans, and sometimes that is necessary coming from that background, but how much honing down in terms of some specific actions that can be taken, or whatever they may be.
We understand the issues well. What we need to understand further, for example, in terms of the impacts of industrial and adjoining communities, is where those thresholds are and the distance. So my I guess recommend or suggested way forward would be that the current processes will clearly outline the next steps and the tools and what those key issues are, and the proposed responses to them. So in the tools, in terms of, for example, looking at a plan change, we would then go through the Section 32 analysis, which would start to look at more detail of those options. So by way of example, if you were to be looking at a lighter industrial area, what exactly are the rules around that? Whereabouts is that light industrial area placed in terms of, and through that process, getting a better understanding, for example, what sort of distances do we require between certain activities? So I think the direction coming out of this process can be clear on terms of the next steps, but further research and analysis is required to step through the detail as we proceed.
What we're intending to bring you before the end of the calendar year is a list of the next bunch of prioritised plan changes. So that would come to this committee. So we're basically plan change 33, that work is now well underway and completed. So what is the next batch? And the centres hierarchy and this industrial land will be core priorities for your direction, so we could get moving on that.
So the study essentially provides that direction or path of travel, but in terms of subsequent stages, such as, and you mentioned section 32, the development of the actual evidence base will then occur at that point in time, as opposed as part of the Mount Industrial Planning Study.
So we're building some of that evidence base as we work through now. There's quite a lot of work analysis done. But however, I guess to the earlier point, it will need to be a very robust process. So we need to make sure we dot all our I's, cross our T's. So it'll be ongoing development of analysis. And I think to Christine's point, towards the end of the year, you will receive the recommendations of the Mount Industrial Planning Study, the Mount Spatial Plan, and the ongoing work program for plan changes and so forth at the same time.
Just think it's quite important that it's spelled out with a degree of clarity in terms of what then may or may not need to happen next, because there could well be these expectations on the Mount Industrial Planning Study that study can't actually deliver on its subsequent processes. So I think that all needs to be very clear, put on the table so all parties can understand and see that.
We can talk to David Fizakli, who's doing the Mount Industrial, so makes that really clear around what the study does and then how does it flow through, but also in the Mount Spatial Plan, we can talk about that. So that will certainly give direction and guidance of where we're heading, but we do know that there are commercial interests who would be actively involved in any plan change process, I'll put it that way. So we do need to make sure that our technical analysis is robust. So while it can give direction, we need to beef up, make sure we've got sufficient technical analysis to get through, so that at the end of the day you get the outcomes on the ground that you're looking for. Yeah.
So move that we receive the update. Bill and Bruce. Thank you very much, Carl. That's going really well. And so I'm just trying to remember when we see you. We won't see you before you go out with the general direction for.
Correct. We were intending to engage through September, and then we would look to come back to you following that with as a draft plan for consideration.
I'll bring the formal report back. So yes, we will link you in so you know about it. It's always our practice. Nothing goes out publicly that you're not aware of.
That's what I was thinking in the back of my head, seeing some of it is so sensitive. Okay, I'll put that then. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the meeting. So Te Pio sent us, put his apologies in, so if we can record those. And he sent some notes which are just being distributed. All right, so that's fine. So I think we will close the meeting. So we've moved the minutes. We did that all together at the beginning. So we have nothing in public excluded today. So I think I'll close the meeting. What time? Can I check what time lunch is?
It's arrived at 5:30,
okay.
But going down for you.
Right. So if we close the meeting, go down, have some lunch, come back and have just the brief workshop. Does that fit for everyone?
What time would you like?
I think we'll come back at 1. Do you think? We don't need longer than half an hour. Oh, actually, why don't we come back at 1:45? So do we want to cut a key to finish, or are we going to come back and we'll do it at the end of that? Okay. So I declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much, everyone.